Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. It's always nice to speak to people, even if it's virtual. So, my name's Claire Agutter. I'll introduce myself in a little bit more detail shortly, but just to kind of give you some context for today's session, Scopism, which is the organisation logo that you can see on the top right of the screen there. Scopism is the organisation that has created the SIAM Foundation body of knowledge, which was available in 2016. And at the end of last year, we finished working on the SIAM Professional body of knowledge. So I had a slightly less hands-on role in the creation of that particular document. So the lead architects were Michelle Major Goldsmith and Simon Dorst, who are two real SIAM experts from Australia. But the foundation and the professional are both available now. They're both free downloads from scopism.com, so you can go get them if you hadn't had them already. But what I would like to do today is just use this presentation to kind of share some of the sort of the practical things that we discussed when we were writing the professional body of knowledge, because the foundation body of knowledge was fairly simplistic. As you would expect at foundation level, it's all about definitions, roles, challenges. But at the professional level, we had a really good opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into the experiences of the author group. And we had people in the author group from all over the world. We didn't have anybody from Denmark actually active in the author group, but Casper did come in. Casper Miller came in at the end and was a really active reviewer, so we did have some input from this part of the world as well. So what we're going to talk about today is a very, very short introduction to SIAM, so just to kind of make sure that everybody on the call is kind of working with the same definitions. And then we're going to look in detail at the SIAM Roadmap. So these are the kind of the stages that a SIAM project or a SIAM transformation will typically go through. And we'll look at some kind of examples of good practice and bad practice from each of those stages based on what the author group shared with us. And towards the end as well, we have got a couple of questions that we'll look at together, so I'll ask you to contribute a little bit as well, but we'll see how we go with that, because I know sometimes people can be a bit shy on webinars. Because we've got a fairly small group today, I'm pretty comfortable if people want to ask questions as we move through the material. So if there is something that I'm talking about on a particular screen and you think, oh, I wish I'd just like to know a little bit more about that, if you pop your hand up, Fabian will see that, will unmute you, and I'm happy to kind of deal with questions as we go, so please don't be shy. So a little bit about me, just in case you haven't come across me before. I've worked in service management for all of my career, really, apart from a little bit of time working in retail very, very early on in my career. And the way that my career has evolved is the same way I think that service management's almost evolved, because early on in my career, I learnt the very traditional service management practices. I learnt about ITIL and I learnt about ISO 20000. But as my career's matured, I have kind of come to the realization that we need more than just one area of knowledge as service management professionals. And as I've then worked with other businesses through my training company and through consultancy, it's become apparent that, in addition to your strong base in service management, we need to understand things like SIAM, we need to understand things like COBIT. We need to kind of constantly evolve our skills, because the way that IT works within organisations is changing. So, as I've gone through my career, I've kind of added more and more tools into my toolbox, I guess. And SIAM was one of those that just seemed like such an essential area for me, for service management professionals, because more and more IT capability is being outsourced, and it asks us to have a very different skill set. It means that we have to have a procurement skill set, more commercial awareness, more and deeper skills, I think, in supplier management, things like negotiation, mediation. So SIAM for me is something that is essential for service management professionals, but it's very much the case that this asks us to look at things from a different perspective. So that's just a little bit about me. I'll put some contact details up at the end as well, and you can always get in touch if you need to. Whoops. So we've structured this presentation today around kind of the good, the bad and the recommended, because there's already a lot of sort of misconceptions around there about SIAM and what it is and what it isn't. So I thought I'd kind of kill some of those myths and those rumours quite early on in this session. So in terms of the bad about SIAM, SIAM is a coherent methodology that it's important to understand, but things do get a little bit lost in translation. So just so that we are all thinking in the same direction, SIAM is not the former name for Thailand. Well, it kind of is, yes, but also that's not really what we're talking about here. But it does make it really challenging for me when I'm trying to do Google Analytics and things on SIAM, because I get all sorts of strange results. SIAM's also not a silver bullet. So it seems to be a tendency that we have, particularly in IT, to pick things and think that they're going to solve all of our problems. So if you've tried ITIL and not got the results that you wanted, and you've tried DevOps and you've not got the results that you wanted, SIAM's not going to be the next best thing that will then fix all of your problems. So we'll kind of repeat this theme throughout the session today, but SIAM is very much about building it on top of what you're already using. So if you're already working with ITIL or DevOps, those things have to kind of mesh with SIAM. And SIAM's not a fad, so it's not a fashion. It's not something that's just appeared because it's trendy or because some consultants are pushing it. It actually originated round about the early 2000s, and it came from the UK public sector. So it came from UK government. That's where it was kind of evolving. But then it has been picked up by lots of large service providers and service integrators who've then kind of developed it and gone off in their own direction. But it's certainly, working with the companies that we've worked with when we developed the body of knowledge documents, SIAM is not something that's going to disappear tomorrow. In fact, I would say that the need for SIAM is only going to get stronger and stronger. And I actually see SIAM growing outside of IT much more and being used just to manage service provision across multiple providers across organisations, and we've already started to see some examples of that. And like we said, you know, SIAM is not a replacement for ITIL. It's not taking over where ITIL left off. It's not taking over because ITIL didn't do what we wanted it to do. SIAM is going to build on any ITIL processes that you have, but it just helps us to extend those across a complex system with multiple service providers. So the good, lots of nice things about SIAM. SIAM can be looked at as an evolution of service management. So people have said to me occasionally, you know, isn't this just supplier management? You know, isn't this ITIL supplier management? And I've said, well, yeah, but I think in the supplier management section of service design, you've got maybe 10, 15 pages. What SIAM is it's an evolution of that thinking. So it builds on supplier management principles, but it's about specifically how we apply those over multiple service providers. So it applies to different types and sizes of organisation and different industry sectors, but it gives this organisational structure and these structural elements that help to extend processes across multiple service providers. So a lot of the traditional service management frameworks are very process focused. SIAM incorporates those processes, but looks at the different layers, the different stakeholders in the model, and provides this kind of functional and structural approach that actually shows you how these things are going to be configured within an organization. So there is so much good to come with SIAM, and that kind of brings us on to the recommended. So why bother with SIAM? You know, what's wrong with ITIL, COBIT, Agile, Lean? Think of SIAM as building on these things. So if we look, for example, at something like ITIL, which is still the framework of choice for many organizations, ITIL has, to a slight extent, adopted outsourcing, but it hasn't really come up with any approach or any specific practices that are going to help organizations when they're working with multiple service providers. You know, in today's environment, everything is a service. IT is an integral part of business, but it's more complex than it's ever been before. And you know, these constant changes, the fact that a lot of the complexity is hidden because the technical complexity is managed by the suppliers, makes the environment very, very different. So in a digital first world, we still need to think about things like security, capacity, availability, continuity, but not perhaps from the perspective of doing them ourselves. It's more about, have we got the right contracts in place with our providers? Have we got the assurance that these things are being done? So we might not be carrying out these activities ourselves, but we still need to be confident that someone somewhere is doing them. So within what we call a loose coupling environment, so where services are provided by lots of different providers who can be removed or added in a fairly flexible and seamless way, SIAM is actually going to help us, and it's going to give us the guidance in order to do that. So it gives us that structural capability. So really, as service management professionals, and depending where we are in the SIAM model, but looking at whether we're a service provider or a commissioning organisation or a service integrator, we need to understand what the impact of this is on our skill sets personally. What do we need? You know, do we need some more commercial or contractual awareness? Do we need some more procurement support from elsewhere in the organisation? Some of the softer skills like coordination, negotiation, influencing, they're also that much more important within a SIAM ecosystem, because we have to mesh together these organisations who perhaps have conflicting competitive desires. So a SIAM model, the collaboration within it, changes the skill set that we need as service management professionals. And like we've said, it's not just for IT anymore. If we think about the concept of digital transformation, of shadow IT, and IT actually being out there within the functions within the business, our SIAM model might actually extend right across the organisation. So it's important that we look at SIAM within the perspective of how the organisation is actually evolving as well. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on these, because I'm kind of hoping that most people who are on the webinar today have read the body of knowledge document, certainly the foundation one, if not professional. If you haven't seen these definitions and these diagrams that I'm going to show you, they are all in that body of knowledge document. They're in the foundation and they're in the professional, so you can go and get a copy of those after the webinar and just read this in a bit more detail. But you can see the kind of the definition there of SIAM. So it's a management methodology applied in an environment that includes services sourced from a number of service providers. So basically, SIAM is about thinking, how do we get the maximum value? How do we structure a multi-provider environment in a way that gives a maximum value to the commissioning organisation? And, you know, we focus on the commissioning organisation. They are really important, but how do we make sure that everybody in the SIAM model is actually getting some value from this, because SIAM changes how we look at our service providers. Suppliers aren't just people that you kick when things go wrong anymore. We need to be working collaboratively. So there needs to be value for everybody within the SIAM model. And I think we've just had an example of, I guess, quite poor supplier management in the UK. So Carillion, which was a very, very large service provider to our government, has just gone into administration, and what they were actually doing was bidding for contracts at prices that they knew weren't sustainable and that they knew weren't going to be profitable, in the hope that, you know, more profit could be found elsewhere or more work could be won. And that, you know, now when we're so reliant on our suppliers, that's not an effective way to do business. So we need to think, when we're looking at our SIAM model, does this work for everybody? We need to be kind of sure about that as well. Sorry, you just got a quick flash of Japan there, which is nice. So this shows a kind of a simplified version of a SIAM model. So you've got the customer organisation there, which is the commissioning organisation. The customer organisation will have some retained capabilities. So sometimes we call that the intelligent client function, but the customer organisation is the one who sets the strategy, provides the overall governance. And then you've got the service integrator that works between the service providers and the customer organisation. So the service integrator is removing an awful lot of the headache for the customer organisation and giving them that end-to-end perspective. And I guess the thing that I would just point out quickly here is remembering that these service providers can be internal to the customer organisation or external, but we manage them in the same way. So if you're looking at that model, the customer organisation, the service integrator, and some of the internal service providers, they might all be staff who work for the same organisation and who are paid by the same organisation. But within the SIAM model, we need to be careful how we manage those, and we need to provide the appropriate structures and governance forums to make sure that we're managing them appropriately, even though they are just, you know, they are technically all colleagues. And then this diagram here, again, just really quick, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but some examples of what's happening within each of those layers. So the customer organisation is at the strategic level. The service integrator is providing that end-to-end coordination and assurance. And at the delivery level, the service providers are responsible for whatever it is that they're contracted to do. So they're responsible for their small or large piece of the value network, but they're also responsible for engaging with the other stakeholders within the SIAM model. And a very quick timeline. So SIAM has been around since, you reckon, early to mid 2000s. It's actually quite astonishing how many companies think they invented SIAM. The detective work that we did, we're fairly happy originated in the UK public sector, which also gave us ITIL and Prince 2. But a lot of the big service provider organisations like Atos and Tata Consulting have then taken SIAM and kind of pushed off in their own direction. So when we set up Scopism a couple of years ago, we were doing some market analysis as to areas where we felt that there was a need for some content and perhaps associated training within the service management world. And SIAM was one that came up because it was being adopted all over the world, but there wasn't any single consistent source of information that was available to people. So Axelos actually sponsored a couple of white papers in 2015, and then in 2016 we worked with the global group to write the foundation body of knowledge, and then that was turned into a training scheme. So we worked with Exin and BCS, and APMG have also gone live with it now, but they worked with us to develop an exam and a qualification scheme to go with it, so that training's available now. And then last year we built on that really big author group last year and really good input from all over the world to write the professional body of knowledge. And what we tried to do there was recognise the fact that, I guess, to a certain extent, while they have common themes, every SIAM transformation can be different. So within the professional body of knowledge, we've got some kind of more hands-on information and a little bit more detail, just to try and I guess give you some practical examples of how things might be for you if you're working as part of a SIAM transformation. Okay, so within the first body of knowledge that we wrote, we defined, I guess isn't quite the right word, but everybody from the author group shared what a SIAM transformation looked like for them. And from that, I guess we attached names to these stages within the SIAM roadmap. And the roadmap is there just to give people a definition to work with. So for an organisation that's new to SIAM, to give them some structure to help them to plan. And I think the really important thing to sort of say here is these stages, we've written them kind of sequentially. That might not be how it happens. So depending on your timescale, depending on your current sourcing arrangements, sometimes these activities might be happening in parallel. Sometimes the bare minimum might be done. Sometimes you might get as far as implement, something changes and you've got to go back to the beginning. So remember that the stages are there for guidance. They're not there to try and force you into some big waterfall program. And in fact, one of the authors on the professional body of knowledge project said that unfortunately in his experience, he tended to find that the contracts got signed and then they had to go to site and figure out what on earth was going on. So he worked for a large service integrator and he said, you know, all this talk about planning's lovely, what a fantastic idea. Unfortunately, that's not how it works for us. So, you know, when you're going into this, you need to think about what you're trying to achieve and by when, and then look at how this roadmap's going to work for you. So the first stage in the roadmap is discovery and strategy. And what I've put up on screen is the outputs. So it seems a bit strange to start at the end, but these are what you should have by the time you've been through that discovery and strategy stage. But I'm going to talk a little bit about it as well. Because this is the first stage of a move towards the SIAM model, one of the things it just can't be emphasized enough how much time is needed here. There could be a real investment in time just to decide actually if SIAM is appropriate and whether you want to move forward. So the customer organization at this point needs to look at itself and think, do I have the capability to do this? You know, do we have the capability internally to make some of these decisions and carry out some of this discovery and some of this mapping? Because if that capability doesn't exist, this is where an external organisation might actually come in as an advisor and bring some SIAM skills. So we're not talking about bringing in an external service integrator at this stage. What we're actually talking about is some kind of design consultant with experience here who can actually come in and, you know, maybe slightly decrease the amount of time that's spent during this stage. A lot of what we talk about in SIAM, we kind of emphasize the theme of impartiality. So if there is any external advice being taken at this point, particularly if there is a chance that that organisation might in future act as some kind of external service integrator, it's important to remember that impartiality has to be there and to make sure that boundaries are respected and boundaries of responsibility and accountability are clearly understood. But at this point, you know, the customer organisation needs to be thinking about, what are our objectives? What's the value that we're trying to get out of this? Because if they're really not clear at this stage, the rest of the roadmap could well be a bit of a disaster. And at the end, it's not going to be clear if objectives were actually achieved or not. So some good and some bad practices about the discovery and strategy stage. If we start with the good, just to kind of get everybody remembering that this is about nice things after all. One of the approaches that was shared with us by the author group when we were working on the professional body of knowledge, it came from a UK public sector organisation, so a UK government organisation, who adopted what they called an open discussions approach to actually help them understand SIAM and what benefits it could bring, because they'd heard about SIAM and they kind of thought potentially it could add value to the organisation, but they wanted to explore that in a bit more detail. So they were taking the whole discovery thing quite seriously. So they used a government marketplace tool, which is something that the UK government set up, and Denmark being a very progressive country, I would imagine that you've got something fairly similar. But they used the government marketplace tool to kind of find some potential service integrators that they could work with, but then invited them in for a meeting to have an open discussion, share what they were trying to achieve, and just get some input. So the service integrators all had an option to give their views, give some advice on what might be appropriate, and that really helped that public sector organisation to understand what options were there and what was going to be most suitable for them. So by having that discussion period, they actually, I think, saved themselves quite a lot of time going into a much more formal tender process. And that was a contrast, kind of skipping over to the bad side of the things, that contrasts with an experience that another member of the author group had, and they were actually bidding to be a service integrator, and the customer organisation sent them a tender document that had 900 questions in it, and most of those questions had free-form text answers. And I was discussing this with the person who was in the author group, and just we were saying, you know, they're working with 3 or 4 organisations. Each of those organisations is sending 900 plus answers back. The likelihood of them reading them, let alone understanding them, seems very, very slim. So how the process is initiated and how you work with external organisations can actually make a really big difference. And the other thing that the customer organisation should be thinking about at this point, which is on the good practice side of things, is enterprise architecture. So if the customer organisation wants to be able to benefit from loose coupling of its services and be able to add and subtract suppliers really simply, it has to understand its own architecture, because if it doesn't, then they're going to have this kind of weird mishmash of things that have been pulled together, stitched together in some kind of Frankenstein's monster, and that's not going to give them an adaptable, scalable SIAM ecosystem. So enterprise architecture was something that came up as really essential to think about at that point. Some other examples of bad practices were failing to manage the transformation as either a project or a program, depending on the size of it. So again, some examples from the author group of organisations that were almost trying to do this in addition to business as usual. within the IT department. So, you know, moving to a SIAM model is a very substantial project. It's a huge piece of work. It affects processes, attitude, behaviour, culture, contracts. It affects everything. So it needs to be taken seriously, and the stories that were shared, the organisations that tried to stitch it onto business as usual, they weren't particularly successful, unfortunately. And the other kind of bad practice, which I guess applies to any project or program, but I think particularly for SIAM, where a lot of the benefits can be fairly intangible, seems to be really, really important, is not articulating what benefits were expected, and then also not checking where the benefits were realised. So not being clear about what we hope to achieve from the SIAM model. Is it cost reduction? Is it annoyance reduction, or noise reduction as we called it? You know, what do we expect to see, and then at what point are we going to check those as well, because the transition to a SIAM model can take years. You know, 5 years was talked about for some of the bigger programs, so that's really important there. So just to kind of remind you about the recommended for the discovery and strategy stage, be clear about why you're doing this, get a realistic picture of where you are now, and then be realistic about the potential benefits as well. So probably no massive shockers there, but the number of stories that the author team had to share suggested that sometimes we're better at saying these things than actually doing them. So the next stage in the roadmap is plan and build. So when discovery and strategy completes, then this stage normally begins, assuming that everything's going nicely. And plan and build, you can see the outputs here, but really this is where we kind of get into the detail of the design of the SIAM model. So this is where everything's pulled together, all the plans and all the approvals are in place before we actually move on to implement something. So what we're going to talk about again is some good examples and some bad examples here. And when it came to good, all of the good stories that we had from the author team were really about having that focus on organisational change management. So this stage is, you know, things aren't necessarily happening yet, but we need to plan our organisational change management approach, because if we've got this structured approach in place to support all of the individuals who are affected, there's much more chance of this being successful. And again, the author team shared a lot of stories about organisations that had lost key people, not because their jobs were at threat, or, you know, because they were going to be reassigned to something that they didn't want to do. They just lost them because they didn't actually communicate the benefits. They didn't tell people what was happening and why. And again, it feels so basic, it feels so obvious, but the stories were that this quite often wasn't done. And the other good practice that I wanted to highlight here is this is actually your first opportunity to start getting people working together. So if you have at this point got your service integrator in place, if you've got some existing service providers that will be transitioning into this model, or you've started to appoint the new service providers, this is your first chance to get them working together and start to build those relationships. And we had an example here for a health service organisation, and the service integrator, when they were appointed, very quickly realised that its own staff, and quite a lot of staff in the service providers as well, had no idea what the impact of service unavailability was on end users. And with it being health service, that impact could actually be quite severe. So they introduced a customer experience program, and it was part of the induction process for staff within all organisations within the model. There was no discrimination. It wasn't just the service integrator, and that actually really changed that around. So bad practices potentially here. A lot of it comes back to trust. So we've just talked about building your collaboration model as being a good practice. It is possible during this stage to do things which actually decrease the level of trust. So we had one example of an external service integrator that came in, and it demanded all of the service providers give it copies of all of their processes, all of their role descriptions, all of their metrics, and it didn't say why. So all of the service providers said, no, that's our intellectual property. You're a competitor. And it took a long time to rectify that situation, to identify what information was actually needed. But those relationships were actually kind of damaged a little bit at the start. So that wasn't a particularly good practice there. So recommended for this stage then, things to think about. Don't underestimate how long this is going to take, because again, this can take a while. Choose the right partners, get the foundations in place, get the right contracts, and start your organisational change management journey immediately. Always have that in your mind. And we've got within the body of knowledge, you'll find a lot of information about a change management approach called ADCAR, which I would recommend you read, because there's some really sensible things in there that apply, within a SIAM transformation, but outside that as well. So then the third stage in the roadmap is where we implement. So at the end of this, the SIAM model is going to be in place and operating with all its supporting contracts and agreements. And really the decision that organisations are making here is, are we going for a big bang approach or a phased approach here? So depending on, what suppliers you've got in place, when contracts end, if you're starting in a kind of a greenfield environment or not, you might actually phase in your SIAM model, which is one of the reasons it can be quite tricky to measure the benefits. But the good practices and bad practices here, really interesting good practice that was shared, because this can be very tough on the people who are being affected. They might actually transition across to a different organisation as part of this SIAM transformation. And one of the author groups shared her experience about when she was working for an organisation that used to have internally sourced IT, but then was actually taken over by another organisation that wanted to integrate it into its existing SIAM model. And a lot of the organisations within that SIAM model and the service integrator were based over in India. So this was a UK-based company. So a lot of the internal IT staff were actually going to be losing the jobs. Those jobs were going to be outsourced to India. But what the company did was it said, look, we'll pay for you to go to India. We'll pay for you to train the staff. We'll pay for you to actually spend some time with them, and we'll give you actually quite an interesting experience. So what they all got was an opportunity to work overseas, and they got a financial reward. So even though it was a really tough time for those staff, they were losing the jobs, the company looked after them as best they could, and there's kind of a reputation thing that comes with that as well. The bad side of things, a lot of the stories here came from an insufficient understanding of the applicable legislation and regulations. So it's different in every country, and we do have an appendix in the professional body of knowledge that talks a little bit about the different legal requirements in different countries, but we would hate anyone to think we were giving legal advice, certainly. But we have things like in the UK, we have TUPE, which is Transfer of Undertakings and Protection of Employment Regulations. When things are happening, when jobs are being moved or when jobs are being made redundant, it's so important to actually make sure you're following the relevant legislation, regulations. There can be a financial impact if not. There can be a reputation impact as well. So this period of transition, this implement stage, can be a bit awkward for everyone. So having some kind of early life support, emergency support system in place will really help to make sure that the SIAM model gets bedded in. So recommended things here: keep your organisational change management efforts moving, be aware of any external factors like legislation or like contract end dates with your existing service providers, and build those relationships. Get the meetings in place, get the process forums, the working groups, the governance boards, get people talking to each other, and pay particular attention to that if you are in a distributed environment where people don't have the opportunity to interact face to face. So the final roadmap stage is run and improve. So once the transition's over, run and improve is about managing the SIAM ecosystem and day-to-day delivery. So processes, activities, teams, measuring performance, nurturing the culture, and also identifying opportunities for improvement, because we should always be looking for ways to do things better within the SIAM environment. So if this, if the implement stage was phased, run and improve kind of takes on elements of delivery in an incremental way, but at some point we have to kind of say, right, that's it, we're into run and improve now. The service integrator will be responsible here for end-to-end measurement and reporting, but again, that should just be a case of using what was developed in the plan and build stage and getting that end-to-end view rather than just focusing on what one particular service provider is doing. And some good examples and some bad examples here. When it came to good, the suggestion was to treat this like a family. So the parent, which is the service integrator, need to be firm with their children, which is the service providers, but rather than being authoritative, they guide and direct them and are fair to all of their children. So it's never a case of, do this because I've told you to. It's about everybody understanding where they fit within the family. So it's an interesting way to look at it, but it's a good way of kind of reinforcing the fact that we're changing how we look at service providers here. They're not just, stay in your box and do what you're supposed to do. We want everyone to contribute. So everybody needs to work together like a family, and then everybody will actually get benefits. And the other good practice, good point to mention is making sure that there is complete impartiality. No matter how you've structured your service integrator, whether they're internal or external, they've got to be fully impartial. And this is particularly important. We had some kind of horror stories where there was an external service integrator, but they were also one of the service providers, and the Chinese walls that should have been in place within that organisation were not effective. So, as a customer organisation, monitor things. As the service integrator, make sure you are completely impartial, and as a service provider, make sure again that you're acting in a fair and appropriate way. And the other bad practice is just not measuring. It can be really, really difficult, but again, a lot of stories from the author team about good intentions of moving to a SIAM model, but then not being able to prove what was working and what wasn't, having a measurement system that still allowed service providers to point fingers at each other and say, well, it wasn't me, it was them over there. So I guess that kind of then falls into the improve activities, making sure that if our measurement framework isn't up to date and isn't appropriate, isn't meeting our needs, that we actually do something about that. So the recommended here would be, this is business as usual. So think about if personnel change, how are you going to manage those relationships and make sure that that collaboration continues? How do you maintain your structural elements, which are your governance boards and your process forums? It's very, very common when a meeting's been running for a long time for it to be seen as less important, and then more junior people go to the meeting and it just becomes poorly attended. So keep those going and don't lose sight of that concept of partnership. You could be working with organisations within a SIAM model for years potentially. So when things are going wrong, it's a case of looking at how you rebuild that partnership and actually move on. Okay, so time for you all to get a little bit involved here. So for the last part of today's session, what I'm going to do is just ask you some questions and kind of get you thinking a little bit. So what I think we'll ask you to do is maybe put your answers into the chat box, and Fabian can actually share a few of these. But I'd just like to kind of get you thinking about these questions, and then what I'll do is I'll actually share my perspective on these as well. So I'll kind of share a few things that occurred to me when I was looking at these. But the first thing that I thought it would be good to get your perspective on is, what are the challenges of introducing a SIAM model when it's a mature organisation? So when we talk about the organisation here, I'm talking about the customer organisation. So if it's a mature customer organisation, it already has some service providers in place, it already has some internal service providers. What challenges might we see when we try and introduce a SIAM model? And I'm going to go quiet for kind of 2 minutes here, just to give you some time to think and pop some ideas into the chat box.
Okay, so we got one from Lars. I don't know if,
Okay.
if you guys you can still type in as I read out. We have more coming in now.
Okay.
We have first from Lars, Christian Larsen. He writes, I believe identifying the retained capabilities as well as documenting them. Oh, 1 second. Just 1 second. Sorry, it's just one more coming in. The window is getting smaller. Okay, so as well as documenting them is a challenge even in a mature organization. So that's the first one.
Okay.
So let's just continue, or we have 3, 4 at the moment.
Okay, if you want to pick one more and
yeah,
leave
okay.
that one out.
Here, difficulties for the suppliers to understand the new paradigm. They are partners in the new setup.
Yes, that's so true.
Yeah, even though the organization is mature, it requires a lot of the organization.
Yep, that is absolutely true. And some of the...
Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
So some of the things that I kind of considered here was changing the perception of suppliers. So if we currently kind of see our suppliers as, you know, not very involved with delivering value, they're there to just do one thing, then this is a way of changing that perception. Reinforcing the roles as well. So I think, like that person just said, you know, if a supplier already has a relationship with the customer, it can then be quite challenging for them to start going through the service integrator rather than directly to the customer. And one of the authors who worked as a service integrator said that she'd actually taken to kind of following one of the suppliers around and go, you know, where are you going? Oh, I'm going to talk to the customer. Why aren't you talking to me? Until that behaviour was really reinforced. So, you know, any in-house skills that the customer organisation has, make the best use of those in kind of building those new relationships. Another question here, I am watching the time as well, so I'm going to give you a minute just to be clever on this one. For the service integrator, what skills do they need to be effective in their role? So put some ideas into the chat box for that one. Okay, so that's time up on that one. If you want to read some of those out, please.
Yeah, so we have one coming from Lars again, and he writes contract management and negotiation as a skill that is required.
Yep, absolutely. Top mark to Lars.
We also had a question. I don't know if we should, or you can. I'll just save it for later, maybe.
I can take the question if you want.
Yeah. This is Kip Sørensen who writes, "Hi Claire, in terms of Danish companies, which is often smaller than the UK ones, when does it make sense to use SIAM?"
Oh, do you know, this is such a good question because we had a lot of discussion within the author group about how SIAM is evolving, and you know, typically you do tend to think large organization with dozens of suppliers that's the right time to actually use SIAM. But then one of the author group had some experience of organizations that, and it's difficult to explain because they were calling it SIAM with no service integrator. So rather than go down a full formal SIAM route and, you know, recruit an external service integrator, what they were just doing instead was kind of picking, well, what are the good bits of SIAM? And a lot of it is about getting your suppliers to work together. And they were just saying, well, let's do some of that. Let's look at how we can get our suppliers to work more closely together so that we get the benefits of SIAM without necessarily, you know, all of the overheads. So I think even for, you know, small or even micro organizations, you still tend to be working with numerous service providers now. And as long as what one of your service providers does could potentially impact another, you still need to find a way to kind of get them working together to the best of your ability. So, you know, it's a really good question, and I think it's where we're going to see SIAM actually evolve towards in the future is, you know, a lot more practices coming from smaller organizations as well. So service integrator skills, I kind of said mediation, impartiality, positioning, making sure that everybody's clear about who's doing what. And then the last question which I had, which I can give you 1 whole minute to do, is what would you do to encourage cooperation and collaboration between service providers? And think about, you know, the fact that some of them might be internal and external. So I will give you a minute just to put some ideas in for that one as well. Okay, have we got anything there, Fabian?
Yeah, we have a few.
Perfect.
So Mass writes, make sure that there is a board and forums where suppliers are present and make sure they work towards the same goals.
Yep, that's a brilliant one.
And then we have one from Kim. I think that if you can help saving people's money and / or time, they will embrace more cooperation.
Yep.
And Lars writes, emphasize the end customer's need for end-to-end service management.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. So try and build long-term relationships, look for some innovative ways to get people networking. So, you know, a lot of the British thing seems to revolve around going to the pub and having a beer. But I've been to Denmark. I think that might work quite well for you as well. But, you know, look for different things you can do and kind of try and think outside the box a little bit there. And if things are going a bit wrong, don't be afraid to just kind of push the reset button. Remember, it's a long-term relationship, so don't kind of blow up and think, well, I can't work with these people. You know, it's kind of important to remember that there will be arguments and bumps in the road along the way, but it is about that long-term customer value. So I'm kind of out of time. I've maybe got time for one question, but what I'm doing is just putting my contact details up there as well. So if you do want to kind of ask me anything after today's session, by all means, please do get in touch. But Fabian, I think we've got time for one question if we've got any questions.
Yeah. I haven't got any questions yet, but maybe I could just ask you if you know if there's any future SIAM events planned that the attendees should attend to get more knowledge, or?
Good. Yeah, good reminder. November the 1st in Manchester in the UK, we are having a SIAM conference. So the date's only just been confirmed, so there will be more information coming out very, very soon. If you're registered on the Scopism website, so if you've ever downloaded the body of knowledge, you'll get updates via the newsletter. But if you'd be interested in coming to that either as an attendee or as a sponsor, you can also drop me an email as well, and I'll make sure that we get you that information. But that's November the 1st, and that's in Manchester, which is the flights between Copenhagen and Manchester are you know, pretty regular and fairly short. So that'd be lovely to see you there.
Great. And we just have one quick question in relation to that. Is it a one-day event?
Yes, it is a one-day event.
Cool. Thank you for that, Lars. And yeah.